General Washington, President Washington, Colonel Washington. George held a lot of titles throughout his life, but the one he most identified with was Washington the Planter. Today, we're talking about the least understood aspect of his life, but what he would have considered the most important. How it shaped his public career, his financial aspirations, and the enslaved population that made it all possible with historian Bruce Ragsdale, author of Washington at the Plow. This is Too Complicated for History. Welcome to Too Complicated for History. Today, our guest is author and historian Bruce Ragsdale. Thank you so much for joining us, Bruce.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Whose latest book, Washington at the Plow, The Founding Farmer and the Question of Slavery, covers, a little bit of an underexplored aspect of Washington's life, which is him as a farmer. That part of him kind of gets outshone by, Washington the general and Washington the president. But Washington the farmer was, a pretty big integral part of his life. At least that's the case you make in the book, right, Bruce?
Yes, it is the case I make in the book. And I do think it's probably the most significant dimension of his life that has not been fully explored. People certainly know that George Washington was a farmer and farming was important in Mount Vernon. But I don't think it's ever been fully appreciated just how central it was to his identity, and both in terms of his main profession and source of revenue, but also just what an important part of his life and self-identity being a farmer was. I think he enjoyed farming more than anything else he did. And he took it very seriously, and it was a source of revenue or as a kind of profession with him. But I think he also just deeply enjoyed it, and he could not wait to turn back to farming every time he was given an opportunity to do that.
So before we get into the nitty-gritty of Washington itself, I just wanted to take the time for our audience, for those who might not be super familiar with, the dynamics of the 18th century. The concept of a farmer, at least here in the United States, is something that gets tossed around a lot. It's part of our cultural ethos. I'm thinking about those, and God Made a Farmer commercials that they show on TV every once in a while. Lynn's confused because she hasn't seen them. But I was wondering, Bruce, do you think you could just contextualize what farming was like and what that meant? Because I think it's a little bit, it played a different role in society at the time.
Well, it did play a different role. And also the most interesting thing about someone in Virginia who owns a very large estate and spends most of their time involved with agriculture, so we usually think of them as planters, not farmers. And planter implies that you're relying on enslaved labor, that you're producing a staple crop for export like tobacco, or in other parts of the country it could have been indigo or cotton. And Washington refers to himself as a farmer. He saw it as a real distinction, and that farming was for him something far more creative and organic, and it was following a model of British landlords, not other Virginia planters. And by the mid-1760s, just a few years after he returns to Mount Vernon full-time after the French and Indian War, he's referring to himself as a farmer who's involved with farming. He rechristens a ship that he inherited the Farmer, because this is an essential part of his identity. And it's modeled on a British notion of farming, which was meant to be something that had not just a private enterprise character, but also a civic purpose. That the farmer was someone who enhanced food security, that built up the commercial potential of the entire country, and that there's this very clear model that develops in the 18th century that Washington's enormously attracted to when he's a full-time farmer at Mount Vernon.
So for one quick clarification, he's never actually out there in the field doing any sort of, digging or hoeing or anything, is he?
Well, There's a Scottish visitor who comes in the 1780s who Washington would often invite visitors to travel with him on his daily circuit of the farms, from which he usually sat on his horseback telling people what to do. But there's one visitor said that when he was not happy with the way that some enslaved field worker was doing something, that he hopped off his horse, threw his coat off, and showed the enslaved person how he should be doing his work. So he did occasionally touch the dirt in that sense. But no, he is relying almost exclusively on enslaved labor for agricultural work. And that had been true on the farm in which he grew up, a much smaller farm that was managed largely by his mother after his father died. But even then, on that smaller farm, it's a question of managing and supervising enslaved labor, not actually pulling out the hoe to do the work.
Right. So I think when people think of sort of innovation with farming and pretty much with anything, if you're familiar with the era, your mind kind of goes to Thomas Jefferson because he sort of does all these experiments. But we don't really hear about Washington being an experimenter when it comes to farming. So can you talk about, was he looking at ways to improve farming? When you say that he's learning about agriculture, can you give us a little bit of information on how he was more of a maybe cutting edge farmer for his time, or was he not?
He is definitely a cutting-edge farmer. It's interesting, though, how those historical reputations have changed. You mentioned Jefferson. In his own lifetime, someone who said that after he resigns from the Continental Army, that his greatest ambition in life was to be considered the first farmer of America. And this is recognized during his lifetime. I think if you asked most people in the 20th and 21st centuries who was the first farmer of America during the Revolutionary War, they'd say Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson did very seriously engage in farming and agricultural improvement, but he considered himself sort of a protege of Washington in some ways. He comes to Mount Vernon and asks Washington to show him about new kinds of farming. And it was Washington in his own lifetime who was seen as by far the more significant and far more talented farmer. And it was because of, I think, first and foremost, because of his commitment to innovation and to experiment. And he is one of the leading advocates, I would say the leading advocate in Virginia, of the adoption of British agricultural practices, which are considered the highest standard everywhere in the Atlantic world. Just as he relies on British literature and correspondence with British agriculturalists, so did improving farmers in France and Germany. Even Frederick of Prussia brings in an English farmer because that's the model that they want to adopt. And Washington is at the forefront of that in Virginia and stays that throughout his life and is recognized as such during his own lifetime. Somehow that's lost in his historical reputation, largely to Jefferson. And I think that's more because of the importance of farming to Jeffersonian political ideals rather than the reality of him as a farmer. And it's Washington who is incredibly knowledgeable and in conversation with leading agriculturalists on both sides of the Atlantic.
Yeah, it's funny that you make that comparison, or the importance of farming to like Jeffersonian political, the political system, because it seemed to me that when Jefferson is describing that citizen, that perfect, like, the agrarian citizen, he's sort of describing maybe not quite as large or as lavish, but, Mount Vernon and Washington as like, hey, it's like all of us can be like little versions of him, and then everyone will be happy, and it'll be wonderful.
and Jefferson did, and I idealize, and it was an idealization, the yeoman farmer. Washington never uses that language. He never sees the small farmer as the hope of America. He sees the small farmer as someone who needs to follow his lead, and that he thinks agricultural improvement and change will come from elite landowners. He doesn't see the person who has a family farm and 150 acres as the bedrock of American political society in the way Jefferson does.
That's interesting because I think we see George Washington as a leader as far as being the general in the Revolutionary War, being the first president. But I guess I never thought of him at the era leading innovations in farming. So it's interesting that it sort of expands his role as far as being, a leader of his era.
He saw himself as a leader in this. He had what I think was already an obsolete notion of agricultural leadership. He thinks that farmers will learn by following the gentleman example, and that probably was never as realistic as Washington wanted to believe in the 1760s and 70s. It's not true at all in the 1790s, when there's enormous opportunity with booming American grain prices. And a small farmer doesn't need to follow the very expensive and complicated example of George Washington or his great friends who were all elite landowners outside of Philadelphia, who are among the sort of scientifically the most advanced farmers, but they're not setting the model that farmers will follow in the early 19th century.
You mentioned earlier that a lot of this innovation came out of England, like they were the gold standard. But is there a reason culturally or, societally that at the time that England was sort of pushing the cutting edge of that field?
Yes, very much so. And I think among the most important reasons is the whole question of food security in Great Britain, which is always a huge question. And particularly in the 18th century, where there's one European war after another, especially wars with France, that there's enormous concern with food security and that Great Britain would somehow be self-sufficient, particularly in grain and livestock. And it's that pushes. The central goal of agricultural improvement in 18th century Great Britain was to produce more foodstuff on a small amount of land and to be able to make that land sustainable. And again, it was rooted in this notion of food security it's not a concern that applies, certainly not to the American colonies or to the United States, and not to most of Europe in the same way. But it was through that focus on trying to increase productivity that farmers in Great Britain really did set a new standard, a new model that was followed in Europe and the United States.
Can we take a quick step back and talk about what he was actually growing? You mentioned subsistence farming, so that's food that, you're growing food that you're going to eat. But he had many, many acres. How many acres did he have under a cultivation? It was thousands, right? So what was he growing?
He ultimately has almost 8,000 acres at Mount Vernon, and that's a lot of land by any standard of any society. Yeah. He begins with around 2,500 before he marries Martha and starts buying more and more land. But it's not the largest model of a state to begin with, but it's large. And like most large estates in Virginia at that time, he's most dependent on the revenue from tobacco. And tobacco, of course, had been the dominant staple in Virginia at that point. 140 years or more. And it had an importance even beyond its revenue. It was the key tie to Great Britain. It was a tie not just to the financial services of Great Britain, but also to access to consumer goods, access to legal and family assistance through those merchants. It was really what defined the wealthiest planters in Virginia. And so when Washington begins his life at Mount Vernon, he's focused on tobacco. But I do think that from the very beginning of his full-time farming, when he marries Martha and comes back after the French and Indian War, he's looking for new opportunities. And he recognizes that tobacco is not going to provide the advantages that it had provided Virginia so well for so long. And he starts exploring new opportunities, most important in grain, and especially wheat. And it's a time when there are growing demands for American wheat on European markets, and that just has a ripple effect of increasing demand in the Caribbean for North American wheat. And Washington wants to position his estate to take advantage of what he sees as the direction of agricultural markets. And so even when he diversifies later and grows many more crops and livestock, it's wheat that's at the center of Mount Vernon.
Now, just to follow up on the tobacco, it was the connection to Great Britain because it was just the traditional good, like that's what English markets wanted to be produced and what they could sell?
It's what they wanted out of Virginia, and they would do everything possible to increase production in Virginia, including promoting trade in enslaved laborers, which they saw as a way of increasing tobacco. And tobacco was important not just because it was a valuable commodity, but also because there was a heavy tax on it, and it was an enormous source of revenue for the government. So it wasn't just commercial interest, but government interest, also government revenue depended on tobacco. And tobacco was one of the the crops that was regulated by the Navigation Acts. All tobacco had to be shipped from Virginia to Great Britain, even though by the time of Washington's life, 85% of it is re-exported to the continent. The growing markets are in France and in the Baltic states. But because of those Navigation Acts, it has to be shipped through Great Britain. One of the advantages of wheat that Washington recognizes very early was that it was not controlled by the Navigation Acts. He could ship it directly to the Caribbean or to Lisbon or to the Wine Islands, and he did.
So sorry for the interruption, but we're going to take a brief break now for a word from our sponsors.
I briefly worked at Mount Vernon. It was through my grad program, but I was working with his farm reports. And I remember reading about different experiments he was doing. And one of them, which I was quite baffled by, he was trying to figure out the best way to promote the growth of crops. And so he had 3 fields, and on one he used nothing. It was just the natural dirt. On the other one, he put manure, which we know today, very useful for growth. And the other one, it was plaster of Paris. And I remember asking people at Mount Vernon, I said, did he put plaster on his field? Why? And so I was very confused by that. So where was he getting these ideas from? England? Was he just talking to people and they're like, oh, see if that works?
Well, in the case of plaster of Paris, which is really gypsum, it's a mineral additive.
Right.
The great advocate of that was his friend Richard Peters, someone from Philadelphia, who was another one of the leading agricultural improvers. And there were experiments with it in Great Britain, but it probably has more application in the United States. And but Washington is always doing that similar kind of experiment with planting the same crop in similar soil with different manures, whether it be green manure, animal manure, chemical manures. He would dig up marl, a sort of chalky substance. He also frequently would have mud dug from out of the Potomac because he thought it would have fertilizing qualities. And so he's constantly, his experiments focus above all else on soil and trying to improve the soil and restore the soil.
And this is just a brief aside, but I remember in his papers, he had a machine that I think was for digging up the mud, but it was called a hippopotamus. And when I first came across it, I was very excited because I thought he had a hippo at Mount Vernon.
He had a camel, but not a hippo.
Rather disappointed when I found out it just dug mud.
Yeah.
I was like, oh my gosh, he didn't just have a camel, he had a hippo. But
it wouldn't be the most surprising thing in the world for him to have a hippo. That's really interesting, and that's really interesting as far as like the idea of like that a big concern of his was improving soil quality, because I know that even it seems like those pursuits, whether we've gotten better at it or more mechanized and all that, that seems to be a concern today. Even that those issues of like, how do we increase the productivity of the soil that we're planting on, and how do we maintain that soil quality over time after many plantings. Seems to be a big concern of industrialized farming, even in the United States right now.
No question. A lot of what Washington is doing is what a later generation would call sustainable agriculture, or now, I guess the preferred word now is regenerative agriculture. And he's very much focused on that. He's not always doing what would now be considered the best practice or the most effective practice, but it is one of his highest concerns. What I find interesting is why was this so appealing to him? Because, as I said, America doesn't have a problem with food security. America doesn't have a problem with shortage of land for rising generation of farmers. And I think for several reasons, it just really resonated with Washington. For one thing, it gives an added sustained value to his estate. I mean, his wealth is primarily in a landed estate, and it gives a new value to that, and also a new purpose of him being able to use the estate for experiments that would serve as a public example. But what's interesting is eventually Washington sees this as a source of political stability. And the habit of American farming that most upsets him is the practice of just growing one crop on one set of fields until the field is completely exhausted. And no matter what you grow, you eventually exhaust the soil. And then he recognizes that for Americans, it actually makes financial sense to exhaust the soil and then move somewhere else and start again. And this really horrifies him on various levels. He thinks it looks terrible, and it does. It makes the land look so eroded and spent. But he also thinks it encourages a political instability, that he thinks if people stay on the land and keep sustainability of their soil, they're less likely to move off on their own. They're less likely to head out to the frontier. And he thinks that it will create a slower movement west. He's certainly in favor of moving west. He's certainly in favor of displacing the Indian nations that live there. But he does think that a slower, what he called progressive seating of the West, would both allow for communities to be more politically stable and also to ease the tensions with Indian nations in the West. So it takes on an important role in his sense of how the American Republic would expand.
He seems to have an affinity for stability in a broad sense, like across most of his interests, that is, as far as his worldview goes, like a more stable world is a good world. That's interesting that it bled even into this.
Oh, I think it's
that kind of makes sense with the way,
world, and his sense of the estate is sort of the embodiment of that stable world.
Well, and being with how unstable his youth was, when you think about, he lost his father, moving around, that maybe it was being psychological here. As an adult, he's looking for more stability.
Professionally, it was a much more varied career than most Virginians of his class and background. I mean, the fact it was not usual to go off and become a surveyor. It was not usual for the lesser gentry sons to go off into the military. It was not usual at all. And at each of those points, he had a sense that his direction of life might go very differently. And the far more typical pattern would be to just take over some lands that your family owned and set yourself up as a planter, just like your parents' generation. And that's not true of Washington.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he expressed actually explicitly higher ambitions for Martha's son, his pseudo stepson, the Jackie Custis, was that he had higher aspirations for him to be more than like a horse gambler, which is sort of what those other rich kids ended up doing. Is they were just fancy people.
And Jackie was the paradigm of that.
So we've actually. We brought it up a little bit, but we haven't really dove into how connected the economic driver of this farming or planter society was by slavery, and how genuinely, and this is a big part of your book. It's in the subtitle, "The Founding Farmer and the Question of Slavery," and I thought you're right in having it be that intrinsically tied to the concept of farming and agriculture at the time, because it's there. If you try to decouple them, you're just losing something entirely. Which is that correct? That it were really sort of inextricably linked?
Oh, I think it is, and it's very clear that the story of Washington the farmer is the story of Washington the enslaver. That you cannot separate his control of enslaved labor, his management of enslaved labor, from his life as a farmer and his life as a planter before that. But from the time that he's a child and would have seen his father first and then his mother managing enslaved laborers in the field till the end of his life, farming is absolutely connected and intertwined with slavery. And what's most interesting about Washington's agricultural career in many ways is how consistent his reliance on slavery is, and his willingness to find new ways to exploit and manage enslaved labor to fit new kinds of farming. I think for many years people thought that from the time Washington and other people transitioned from tobacco to wheat, that they were less committed to slavery, that they found it less valuable. And certainly people have thought that after the Revolutionary War, when he adopts what he calls the full course of English farming, that he's less connected with slavery. And I think the most important thing that I found in my work is the exact opposite. Washington is at the forefront of adapting slavery to new kinds of farming, to new agricultural projects. And he wasn't intending to do this, but he's making the choices that would make slavery viable even in the Upper South up until the Civil War, that slavery could be used in types of economies for which it had not originally been instituted. That it is slavery is introduced into the British colonies because of stable agriculture, but Washington proves that it can be both profitable and effective in other kinds of farming. So in the transition to wheat and the transition to a far more complicated farming after the Revolutionary War, I think he not only is finding ways to continue to exploit enslaved labor, he's finding new value in it and becomes more dependent on it. And he wants to be more dependent on enslaved labor even after the Revolutionary War.
I think what's so fascinating about that is that, he's so dependent on it. He is expanding ways to exploit it. But then at the same time, you talk about ways in which he's trying to plan to free these enslaved people. So, he's thinking about how can they become farmers on their own, or how can we end this? I think he calls it odious, or, this institution that in writing, at least, he says he's not happy to participate in. So how do those two things work together?
I think that it's only through his attempts to adapt enslaved labor to this new kind of husbandry after the Revolutionary War, this full course of British farming that he's so attached to, that it's only his very arduous and serious efforts to adapt slavery to that kind of farming that in the failure of that attempt, he then wants to break away from slavery. But that it's only after 7 or 8 years of very arduously trying to adapt slavery to these crop rotations that he decides that it can't be done, and that he then decides he needs to find a way to, as he said, to liberate a certain species of property, and to try to find a way to reinvent his estate one more time so that it can function without enslaved labor. That story is deeply hidden, and he intended it to be deeply hidden. I think it's curious how infrequently he said anything about wanting to free the enslaved people. There's basically only one written statement of his intention to emancipate the enslaved before his will, and that's in the spring of 1794, and it's written on a document that I would argue he hoped would not be preserved. It's in the body of a letter, but he cuts it out into a separate page without a signature on it. And in fact, in earlier editions of the Washington Papers, it wasn't included. And if it hadn't been saved by a descendant of Tobias Lear and somehow bought by the Huntington Library, we wouldn't have that single key to his intention to free the enslaved people.
And he saved everything. So if he was trying to hide that he was trying to hide it.
Absolutely. And he kept a copy of everything. And when he copied that letter into his letter book, which he saw as the archive for history, quite consciously saw it as an archive for history, he does not copy that passage into the letter book.
That's really interesting. And how, we talked about Jefferson and how historical reputations are built, that one piece that extends it beyond, like earlier than as well, like shows a line of thinking, and, how that can become sort of the overwhelming narrative around a particular figure. But I want to, just before we move on or get into a slightly different topic, I just want to point out that it's cool that you pointed out that one of the reasons wasn't a sense of justice that he was necessarily
like a humanitarian.
It wasn't a humanitarian cause. He saw, like what you're saying is, like, I can't apply these people that I have control over to the farming methods I'm trying to use, and I'm still responsible economically for their well-being, for their lives, and to feed them and house them and clothe them, to whatever extent that's true. He saw them as a burden at a certain point, right? Like economically, as far as to his estate. Is that reasonable to say?
But it is not a strictly economic calculus that leads him to reject slavery. He sees it as abhorrent, but it's not abhorrent in the ways that we would associate with 19th century abolitionism. That it's more, he sees it as corrupting of everyone, and he sees it as corrupting of himself in that he has to play this role. And he's very serious about trying to implement this English ideal of a benign rural order, of what in the 18th century would have been called the Georgic order, based on sort of classical notions of a really bountiful and productive landscape of improving nature, of working in collaboration with the laborers, that probably is not realized anywhere at any time, but slavery is such an affront to that ideal. And I think that bothers Washington more than anything else. When he does say that, makes that one statement about emancipation, when he says he wants to liberate a certain species of property, once again, he so often will not even use the word slavery. He finds it so painful to even refer to it several times as a species of property rather than enslaved human beings. But he said it's a species of property which I hold repugnant to my own feelings. It's not that it's a violation of somebody's natural rights or their basic humanity. He may have thought that, but his first description of why he wants to emancipate the enslaved is that holding them is repugnant to him, playing that role of the brutal slave man. And by that time, he's learned it's not possible to be an enslaver and not resort to various kinds of brutality.
So sorry for the interruption, but we're going to take a brief break now for a word from our sponsors.
That's interesting that you said that he felt it was corrupting to himself. And I'm thinking of the notion, like the Protestant notions of the value, the godliness of hard work and seeing the fruits of your labor, and sort of how that relationship, it corrupts that sort of aspect of life, which is, fascinating.
And it's sort of, like politics today, it's how does this affect me? So, he's not necessarily thinking about these individuals who are enslaved. He's thinking about how is this affecting me? And if it's affecting him negatively, then...
Well, there is definitely that. And he's certainly overwhelmingly concerned with reputation, that he does not want to be publicly associated with the worst aspects of slavery. When he's talking about selling enslaved people during the Revolutionary War, he again and again insists to Lund Washington, his farm manager, that he doesn't want a public sale. Later in life, when there's a runaway who's escaped from Mount Vernon, he doesn't want the ad to be placed in newspapers north of Maryland because he doesn't want his name to be associated with trying to recapture enslaved property. And there is a concern with that. But I also think there occasionally is a recognition of the just corrupting effect that slavery has on the enslaved individual. And it's not the kind of deprivation of humanity that we would think of. He believes that the most important motivator of work is reputation. And that he says that the enslaved person has no reason to worry about their reputation. They can't improve their reputation. They can't benefit from it, or so he says. And in that sense, he sees that at heart, there's something just really corrupting and unproductive about a system of labor that depends on coercion.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was getting at with the fruits of their labor and being able to see those things, and the results of your work being intrinsically part of your humanity. But yeah, reputation is a good manifestation of that thought process.
Right. I was just going to say he does seem to care that families stay together. He doesn't want to break them up.
There's no question about that, and I'm always struck by the degree to which he recognizes and on some level respects the bonds of marriage. These are not legal bonds, but to him, these are married couples, and he understands that. And he doesn't always allow the conditions of living that we would think were essential to a married couple, like living in the same place. But he certainly recognizes and understands the strength of these family connections.
Yeah, I think just for our audience, it's important to say that Washington recognized this or acknowledged these things. It's not to say that, slavery isn't a brutal and violent and degrading, dehumanizing institution in the 18th century, but it is a little bit different from what the popular conception of when you think of like slavery and thinking of like chain gangs and cotton fields. That is more of a 19th century version of this institution, what it evolved into at the time. In the 18th century, while still all of those things, had a different dynamic to it. It was slightly less machine-based, especially on the place at Mount Vernon where the work was varied. People were doing all sorts of different things, like, cobbling shoes and repairing clothing and repairing tools and things. It wasn't like, hey, there's this one crop that we need picked. That's what everyone's going to be doing. You're essentially, a mechanized force that's out in the field. Yeah.
I think it's always so important to recognize the varieties of slavery and life that the enslaved lived under these different forms of slavery, and that slavery was incredibly adaptable to. It's one of the most pernicious things about slavery is it could be adapted into so many different environments and economies. But one of the distinctive characteristics of the period in which Washington is an enslaver is that slavery was somewhat more stable in Virginia for a 40 or 50-year period. The African slave trade is dying out and ends completely by the Revolutionary War, at least in Virginia. And also there is not a well-organized internal slave trade. There's lots of selling of individual slaves within Virginia, but there's not the massive relocation of 1 million plus people after 1800. And so what you had is a time of, within the history of American slavery, somewhat more stability in terms of the ability to form family life. And that's quite evident at Mount Vernon, that you could have multiple generations that would be less likely to be disrupted than they would be in the 19th century when almost every large Virginia enslaver is selling some number of enslaved people to the markets in the Cotton South and Louisiana.
And can you talk a little bit for our audience who may not be familiar with Virginia laws? So I think, we say, well, why didn't he free his enslaved people? But there were actually laws that impacted what people who owned enslaved people could and couldn't do with them. So can you just a little overview of that for our listeners?
Before the Revolutionary War, an individual could not emancipate an enslaved person without getting specific permission from the colonial legislature. It happened occasionally. It was usually for an individual, sometimes an individual who was enslaved but was also the son or daughter of the enslaver. That would be true of Martha Washington's father-in-law, John Custis, who did free one of his enslaved people, who was his son, an acknowledged son. But for the most part, it was not. It was against the law to just give a sweeping emancipation of all the enslaved people an enslaver owned. That changes in 1782 when the Virginia legislature makes it possible for individual acts of manumission. And that law stays in effect for about 24 years. And during that time, there were probably 10,000 freed people. And the pattern of emancipation is quite varied, quite different. Sometimes it was a large emancipation. More often, it was an emancipation of a few people. Sometimes it was motivated by religious feeling. Sometimes it was motivated by just a desire not to have to support the enslaved people. And that was often the case in these smaller emancipations. And then in a few cases, it was a commitment to abolition. And so Washington is well aware of those changes in the law, and it is, of course, that law that allows him to emancipate all of the enslaved people he owns through his will.
There's something that I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, and it's the Washington's acknowledgement that, hey, we can't just manumit or emancipate these folks and just say, congratulations, you can go wherever. That there was an acknowledgement that there's something needs to be done such that they can support themselves in some manner or form after that happens. Right. Could you describe a little bit about that idea and Washington's thoughts on it?
Throughout that period where emancipation was legal in Virginia, there is a growing discussion of how do you emancipate people without placing a huge burden on the public treasury, of having to support people who had never been able to support themselves and probably don't have any land. And for large enslavers who provided for emancipation, there were a couple of steps that were usually taken. One was to make it gradual, to not free all of the people at a single sweep. And the other was to either provide for the rehire as wage laborers or to provide some land to serve as tenants. That's what Robert Carter of Nominee Hall, who had a very complicated will that Washington knew well from 1791-92. And it's over a period of years, he provides for the emancipation of several hundred enslaved people who, many of whom then become tenants. He has an entire plantation in Western Virginia that is farmed by freed people who become tenants. So there's lots of debates about what is this process. There's a parallel debate over the merits of expatriation, of forcing the freed enslaved people to leave the country. Jefferson is someone who always seems to think that any kind of plan of emancipation needs to be conditional on that. There were several others that Washington would have known about in the 1790s. It's not really feasible for an individual to expatriate freed people, but I do think it's striking that Washington never even gives any kind of support for the concept of relocation and expulsion of freed people. He always assumes that any plan of abolition will entail the freed people remaining within the society, and his will tries to provide for that and to make that feasible by either supporting those who can't support themselves, training the younger people in some kind of a trade. He makes the provision that they be a court-supervised apprenticeship, basically, and those are the provisions that applied to white orphans and were not normally applied to freed enslaved people, but Washington insists on that standard. The one thing that I think is not appreciated about Washington's provision for emancipation is he does delay it until Martha's death, and that's what gets a lot of attention. But at that point, he's freeing all of these people at once, and that is very unusual in a large emancipation. Also, there are two emancipations in his will, one for the people he owned and controlled at Mount Vernon, and the other for a number of people, somewhere between 40 and 50, whom he owned, who were controlled by relatives of Martha. He had bought them basically to help out the relatives. And he provides for their emancipation in his will. And that emancipation is the more standard practice of people like Robert Carter, where it was to be gradual, it was upon a certain age. And to me, the great interesting question is, why did he apply that fairly standard provision or more frequent provision to the enslaved people that he owned 100 miles south of Mount Vernon, people who he probably had never even met. But he applied very different conditions to the enslaved people at Mount Vernon who were so closely associated with him.
That is interesting. There's another something that we talked about when we were first speaking for the show, that there was an unrealized plan in the works for Washington to have some of the enslaved people that he was in control of moved west. Is that correct? Remember, like, to some of his western lands, and that was pretty late in the game, right? Like, I had never heard of that before. You mentioned
it's very late in the
before
game.
Your book and before you mentioned it. I had never heard of it, that this was something that he was considering doing.
It's a story that we still can't completely piece together. It was first identified and noticed by historian Philip Morgan, who wrote what still I think is one of the most important pieces ever written on Washington and slavery, which is now 23, 24 years ago. And he noticed this in a letter to Washington's nephew, where he talks about it's the first time in Washington's life that he says or acknowledges that he has more slave people at Mount Vernon than he can profitably employ, and that he's looking for some other way to move them and make money off of them. And he asked his nephew to explore possibilities for retaking over some tenanted lands in the West. I had found that the plan was more involved, and that he and at the very end of his life, like in the last few weeks, there are documents that he was planning to send his farm manager west, not just to the tenanted lands to see if he could buy out the leases, but to go on to unsettled lands in the Kanawha Valley in the Ohio region, and to see if he could identify lands that would be settled and worked by enslaved laborers from Mount Vernon. And another very late, the last letter Washington ever writes that he delivers to a farm manager on the day he goes out riding in the rain, He says that he's planning to do this as soon as the spring of 1800, that the first relocation of some of these enslaved people would begin then and increase the following year. What I find most remarkable about this is these steps are being taken after he's written his will. Now, obviously, he didn't know he was going to die in late 1799, but he had written a will, and if he had started this process, it would have just vastly complicated the terms of the will, of who would have been overseeing this, how the enslaved people would be freed, and they would probably be mixed in the working groups with some of the so-called dower slaves that were controlled by the Custis estate. And it's an odd thing for Washington to be doing, and in some ways I can't come up with a full explanation of why, except that he is determined to be able to manage Mount Vernon without relying on a farm manager to do it all himself. He leases one of his most important farms to his nephew, and he leases out the mill and the distillery, and he wants to focus just on the concentrated farms, but he then has to move the enslaved laborers off of that and put them to work profitably somewhere else, and he thinks it'll be in the West. And these are the choices that a lot of Virginians would be making very soon thereafter to maintain the value of their investment in enslaved labor. So at a point when Washington has taken this fairly dramatic step to free the enslaved, and surprising step, I think, he's also taking steps in the exact direction that would maintain slavery as an institution and maintain the enslavement of all these individuals well into the 19th century.
Do you think he was being as secretive about moving them west? And was he thinking of moving them west to then be freed, or moving them west to work as enslaved individuals?
He tells the manager that he doesn't want him to discuss this with any of the enslaved.
Okay.
Because it would have, he's not moving them to free.
Okay.
He's moving them to work the land. But the family connections at Mount Vernon are so deep and so complicated that it would be impossible to do this without breaking up families. Maybe he wouldn't have broken up married couples. I don't know if that would even be, but he certainly would have divided families. I don't think it could practically have ever been done without disrupting the families. So I find that another very difficult choice to explain, why he would be thinking in these terms at the same time that he's written this will that would so clearly and immediately emancipate people under his ownership.
Interesting.
Yeah, this is playing a little bit of counterfactuals to whatever. I mean, I'm curious. Like, it's crazy to think that he was, 5 months away from doing this, and how that precedent of him moving enslaved people out to, the frontier or on, the Western lands would have, at least colored part of the debate about the expansion of slavery into that 19th century. And he being an example to follow, because, we know that, like, lots of what the precedents that were set up and how, it was like, oh, Washington did it. That was what we should be doing. His personality, his actions were a big driver of what is the right way to be an American for a long time. And if that had been part of his story, that might have changed, maybe not, but it would at least been part of that discussion potentially.
He knows it's happening by then. He's consulted with other people. He's given advice to a close friend about this. So he certainly knows that Virginia planters are thinking about maintaining their investment in enslaved labor by moving individual enslaved people to new lands in the West. And as the West opens up more in the 1790s under the federal government, this becomes more and more viable. Yeah. And as commercial routes are extending into the West, it makes commercial agriculture on that scale more feasible. So there certainly are incentives, but it's just odd choice to be making at a time when he thinks he's wanting to leave a very clear model of ending slavery.
Yeah.
That's right. It's like he had a backup. I want to free my enslaved people, but I have this backup in case for whatever reason change my mind at the last minute. Then I'm just going to send them west.
It's a hedge, yeah.
He was a planner.
Yeah.
No, I was saying I don't have an answer to this, but and I don't know one who's ever taken that seriously option. But when I got to that material, I wondered what was in that other will.
Right.
On his deathbed, he asks Lear to take another will out of, and we all know you're supposed to redo your wills, and you're supposed to make sure only the most recent one is there. But why was this one of his last thoughts? Was what was in that will? And there's no evidence that he wrote a counter will at the same time that didn't free the enslaved. But I'd love to know what was being burned by Lear.
Right. I mean, you're on your deathbed and you're thinking, please burn this. It does make you wonder.
Yeah, it's like
that's actually not. Washington frequently wrote letters, which he said, if this is inappropriate he asked, and there are things that. Why did he care about this being burned? He says that about a letter writing of wanting to lease a farm outside Philadelphia when he's going there as president, and he tells Clement Biddle to burn it when he's finished. He tells Arthur Young to burn a letter. That actually, I understand, because that was the first plan to lease Mount Vernon as a step toward freeing the enslaved.
And clearly they didn't listen to him since you know about the letters.
It's like those right. It's like those messages at the beginning of Mission Impossible when Tom Cruise gets the glasses that tell him what he's supposed to do. This will self-destruct in 5 seconds. He wants no trace. That's very funny. But yeah, because it was urgent at the end. The curiosity for me is that he doesn't burn it earlier. That it's like at the end there, like it's still sort of sitting around, right? He doesn't burn it when he finishes writing the other one. That it's still in his desk somewhere or in his library. And then he's like, crap, this might be it. Get rid of that other thing, please.
He likes to plan. He wanted to have options. That's my theory. Up until that last minute, Tobias. He was not making that decision. He was going to have options.
It's like Tobias, please clear my browser history. And then, well, Bruce, it was a pleasure chatting with you again. And, I would recommend for everyone Bruce's book, Washington at the Plow, The Founding Farmer and the Question of Slavery. It's an awesome read. One of the best books of Washington. And I don't mean this just because Bruce is on the call and we're talking to him right now. I've read a ton about Washington, and it is genuinely fantastic, really insightful to him as a person and the era as a whole. It's a great work. It won the Washington Prize this past year.
And it's enjoyable. You learn a lot, but it's also just an enjoyable book to read.
Cool. Yeah. So thanks again, Bruce.
Thank you, Bruce.
You're very welcome. Delighted to have the chance.
Thank you for listening to the full episode of Too Complicated for History. We hope you enjoyed the episode, and if you did, please leave us a review on Odyssey, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to follow us on our social media platforms at 2C4H_podcast, or check out the link in the description. This will keep you in the loop for show updates, new episodes, and exclusive content.
Too Complicated for History is a podcast from Primary Source Media. Produced by Patrick Long and Lynn Price Robbins. Edited and mixed by Curtis Fritsch. Opening theme music by Sheena Biratello.